And you're from Baltimore, Maryland.
He is.
He is. Who else we got here?
My name is Matt Haddow. I'm the Senior Fellow on Public Policy
Gotcha.
with the American Kratom Association.
Okay.
I'm from outside of D.C., not in D.C.
All right.
I want to clarify that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity for us to discuss this important issue. When I told my wife that I was coming to your beautiful city, the capital city in Wisconsin, she said, "What are you going to do there?" And I said, "Well, I'm coming to inform the committee that they made a mistake in 2014 when they scheduled Kratom." And she kindly but firmly said, "Honey, don't tell them they made a mistake. That will offend them." And I said, "But honey, you tell me I make a mistake daily." And she said, "Well, that's different." I said, "How?" And she said, "After 46 years of marriage, if I have to tell you that, you don't understand." So the purpose I'm here is to ask that you consider adjusting a policy that was made in 2014 at the request of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who was at the time wrong and remains wrong on the policy on Kratom. The fact is that when Wisconsin passed the scheduling of Kratom in 2014, they did so at the behest of the FDA, who promised that there would be a scheduling procedure that would be adopted by the Drug Enforcement Administration, where nationally Kratom would have been scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act. That did not happen. But in the interim period, the FDA did convince 6 states, along with Wisconsin, one of them, to schedule Kratom. Since then, the state of Vermont has rescinded their ban, recognizing the mistake that the FDA made. The state of Indiana, Rhode Island, and Arkansas have legislation as similar to what's here today that will rescind those bans as well. So we're unwinding the information that was provided by the FDA that turned out to be inaccurate. When the FDA submitted their recommendation for scheduling on Kratom, they did so in 2016 and 2018 under what's called the 8-factor analysis. That's the critical analysis and scientific evaluation of the safety profile and addiction profile of any substance. And with respect to Kratom, they were making the claims that it met those criteria. Now, interestingly, Wisconsin has the very same 8-factor criteria for scheduling here in the state of Wisconsin. The DEA in 2016 rejected the FDA's recommendation and asked for more information. That information was submitted in a second application to the DEA that was withdrawn officially by the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Giroir, who said to the FDA that they had not met the burden. They couldn't prove the science. In fact, he characterized it in public as embarrassingly poor evidence and data that presented a potential harm to the public health. And that's today the reason we're here, because all of the evidence and data that the FDA did use in order to justify and convince states to ban Kratom is insufficient. They made a third attempt in 2021 to go to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs and ask for international scheduling using that same embarrassingly poor evidence and data. The international standard is lower for scheduling, not as rigorous as ours under the Controlled Substances Act, but they did so knowing that the U.S. is a treaty partner, and if the UN Commission did schedule Kratom, we would be required to commence scheduling procedures here in the United States. Thankfully, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, which is comprised of 12 independent global experts on substance abuse and addiction liability, unanimously agreed that the FDA had failed to meet their burden to justify international scheduling despite it being a lower standard. So today, this bill that you have before you will correct that error that was made, and we're grateful for the fact that the Wisconsin Controlled Substances Board, which reviewed the scheduling procedure and concluded by resolution that it did not meet the criteria, and that is the public record that's before you today. They did express in a separate resolution concern about deregulating, descheduling it and not having regulations, but that is resolved by this Kratom Consumer Protection Act by putting in requirements that say you cannot adulterate a Kratom product. In the 45 states where it is legal today, it is the Wild West. And we're working with 11 states now who have passed legislation that is similar to what you have today. Those states have passed it, and they're protecting consumers. And that's what we ask for, because we are a consumer advocacy organization. We do not represent the vendors of Kratom. We have reported vendors of kratom to the FDA to get them to stop marketing products that are either illegally marketing them using therapeutic claims that are not justified or that are adulterating their products. And we think that a regulation here that you have before you corrects that situation and protects Wisconsinites as they go forward. The National Institute on Drug Abuse has concluded that kratom is a valuable harm reduction tool for people that are struggling with opioids. It's not the only reason people use kratom. About a third of the 15 million Americans that use kratom today use it as like a replacement for a cup of coffee. Energy boost, increased focus. A little higher dose, people are managing symptoms of anxiety and depression. And at higher doses, it is doing what we described, helping people get off of opioid addictions. Johns Hopkins University did a study a couple of years ago of adult kratom consumers using it for the purpose of weaning off of opioids, and they reported that 87% of those individuals had a reduction in their withdrawal symptoms, which is the hardest part of getting off an opioid addiction. 35% replaced opioids with kratom within a year. Those are the reasons why Dr. Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, today testifies regularly before the Congress that kratom can be a valuable harm reduction tool and should be accessible to the American public, despite the FDA's attempts to ban it. She disagrees with the FDA, as did HHS, as did the National Drug Control Policy Office. The FDA is the lone wolf on this because they do not like natural, botanical, or dietary supplements. They want them to be new drugs, and that requires them to go through the NDA process, 10 years, and millions of dollars of investments. And in this case, they're depriving the Americans of valuable resources. We know that the deaths and adverse events that have been reported are because of adulterated products are added or poorly formulated products. That's corrected by this legislation. We are pleased that the American Medical Association clarified their position on kratom at their House of Delegates meetings in Chicago this past June, where they passed a resolution that says that science should drive the policy on kratom, not the opinions of the FDA or anyone else. Science dictates the safety of kratom based on that 8-factor analysis. They say that patients that are struggling with pain issues should have access to physicians to discuss those things, and the policy there ought to be that they have those access and, of course, access to all other products that can help them. And they said that no criminal charges should be made against the person that's using kratom. That's the position of the American Medical Association, and we agree. It may not be the position of the Wisconsin Medical Association, as you've seen from their letters. And then it said, the AMA resolution said, if there are therapeutic claims made with respect to kratom, they should be backed up by clinical trials. We completely agree. We have reported more than 80 kratom vendors over the last 3 years to the Food and Drug Administration that are making those very illegal therapeutic claims. In those 3 years, not a single prosecution. The FDA is not serious about protecting consumers. Unfortunately, what they're doing is trying to prosecute their claim that kratom should be scheduled, and they simply can't meet that scientific burden. You will hear about reports of deaths and adverse events with respect to kratom. Every death is tragic. But the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and even the FDA acknowledge that those deaths are associated with polydrug use and underlying health conditions. There's not a single documented case, despite what you read in the press, of a kratom death alone. We want to find the truth, but it ought to be based on science, not the opinions, and not by an FDA that misleads medical examiners around the country that deprive families of the truth. We think good evidence and data should be used, accurate testing about kratom and blood tox screens and forensic toxicology on any death, and we have examined hundreds of those deaths that have been attributed by various sources to kratom and found all are polydrug use or underlying health conditions that have led to those things. We want to protect the American public, and what we have today is a rampant marketplace with adulterated kratom products that is controlled by one thing: good regulations. We know that caffeine is the most widely used drug in the world, and the FDA finally had to step in and ban concentrated caffeine products that were dangerous. We want the FDA to do the same thing here. Respect the marketplace of safe kratom products and only look at banning those substances that are synthetically derived, which this bill would eliminate, that are adulterated with dangerous substances, which this bill would eliminate, and we encourage the Wisconsin legislature to join those states that have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and protect consumers. Thank you.
I'm Jack Henningfield. By disclosure and experience, I'm Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability at Pinney Associates, and I do 8-factor analyses for professionally, several per year. I'm a Johns Hopkins adjunct professor since 1978, and have been involved in addiction research and medicines development for now 52 years. Before Pinney Associates, I was at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I headed the section that was created in 1985 to assist FDA and DEA on drug scheduling. And in February of this year, I submitted a letter to the Controlled Substances Board of Wisconsin clarifying some of their questions about how 8-factor scheduling works. That is co-authored by three other former federal officials involved in drug scheduling from DEA and FDA. And I leave that with you in case you have questions about the process. The last hearing, by the way, was really interesting and relevant. I mean, to me, it was in part about oversight and guardrails to enable vendors, give them guidance, and protect consumers. That's what we need here. And FDA will come around. I work with FDA. They're the best organization in the world to do this when they put their mind to it. Hopefully more states setting standards will bring FDA along. Let me just make a couple of simple points. Kratom does not meet the legal, scientific, or public health standard for drug scheduling. And that was determined by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, my former institute. And it's rare that DEA and NIDA and NIH line up against FDA. I'm saying it's rare. It basically hasn't happened. And why did it happen? It happened because NIDA follows the science and both follow the public health, and both were concerned that taking away kratom would lead people to go back to opioids. And that was the basis, part of the basis for the Secretary of Health to rescind FDA's order. So what do I mean by legal, scientific, and public health? The legal standards is it botanically in the class of a substance that's already scheduled? And the answer is no. Kratom is in the coffee family. That's part of the reason people use it to enhance their work occupational performance, not detract from it. It's not chemically related to a controlled substance. And it's not botanically related, chemically related, and the overall science does not indicate that it fits the scientific definitions of addictive drugs that we use as the standards, like opioids, like cocaine, like certain sedatives, and so forth. The 8-factor analysis brings that all together. It forces you to look at all of the science. And the public health standard, well, that's the basis for, you've heard of emergency scheduling by DEA or temporary scheduling. That's when something is a known or imminent public health risk. And then that can be scheduled. That's 4 factors that's 3 factors in the 8-factor analysis. FDA had ignored that. And DEA in its initial ruling just listened to FDA and didn't do that analysis. And when they realized that people could die if they banned it, they withdrew their scheduling proposal. So what we need, in my opinion, is regulated kratom, as this bill will provide, so that consumers don't have to go to my home state of Minnesota to get their kratom, or other states, and know that it has the same safeguards as drinking water, as dog food, and other things, some regulatory oversight. If you have any other questions about the science, if the science is there, I can get it. I have done some of the studies myself and in collaboration with colleagues at Hopkins and globally. Thank you for your hearing.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. Representative Spiros, you had a question?
Question. Yeah, thank you both for coming. So I looked up kratom and as far as being safe or unsafe, and the first thing I find is the Mayo Clinic indicates that it's unsafe on their research. And when you look at who's voted, who basically is in favor of this, it's the American Kratom Association. Everybody else has a thumb down, law enforcement and medical societies here in Wisconsin. And when you take a look here, it says that kratom has been classified as possibly unsafe when taken orally. Kratom has a number of known side effects, including weight loss, which maybe I should be taking that, dry mouth, chills, nausea, vomiting, and it goes on. And it also affects the mind and nervous system: dizziness, drowsiness, hallucinations, delusion, depression, delusion, breathing suppression, seizures, coma, and death. And this is from, again, the Mayo Clinic. You can go online, and I just asked the question, is kratom safe? And that's what came up, was this from the Mayo Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic's not that far. I mean, my wife's a nurse, and her views and my views might differ a little bit when it comes down to medication and drugs and things like that. But the issue with this is, why does Johns Hopkins feel one way, the Mayo Clinic feels another way, and then all the medical societies here in Wisconsin have thumbs down? I understand from law enforcement where they're at, but in the private sector, I'm responsible for truck drivers. I'm responsible for the safety and the claims for those individuals. I've already seen what CBD did from the standpoint that I actually voted for that because I saw an opportunity to protect, to help kids that had seizure disorders. And that's really what it came from initially here in this state, and thought that was a good idea, but it's really branched out a lot further. And today, even some of the product with THC is not at the low level, it's at a higher level, which could be, which basically can cause some problems, especially if you're driving. And this one here, when I read about some of the things that this can cause, my fear is that even though it's illegal in other states, and here it's not, still you have somebody who takes something like this and then going down the road or whatever else, they're unsafe, they have a crash or whatever else, finds out that they had that in their system. But just to make sure, and I will commend the bill and the author and you guys for at least looking at it from the standpoint of how can we at least regulate it? And so from that standpoint, I commend you. It's just on the sides here, I'm looking at the research from your research versus other medical societies, and it doesn't sound like everybody's on the same page.
So if I could respond then, but defer to Dr. Henningfield. The Mayo Clinic has not done a single shred of evidence research themselves. They've repeated what the FDA says, and you can verify that with them. We have. There was a philanthropist who went to the Mayo Clinic and offered to give them a blank check to do kratom research that was objective, and they declined, saying that they're deferring to the FDA. So you're seeing, and that's true, an ecosystem of research organizations that work with the FDA. And as Dr. Henningfield said, we want to trust the FDA, and most of the time we can. I can tell you that when I served in the Reagan administration, Department of Health and Human Services, as chief of staff, we had to tell the FDA they were wrong about dietary supplements, and that ended up with a legislative fix, which is coming for kratom, by the way. There will be a federal bill filed with Representative Pocan on the House side and Representative Bergman from Michigan, two diametrically opposed political groups or ideologies, and Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Senator Cory Booker filing the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which will rein in the FDA and force them to actually account for the current state of the science. So on that score, I hope you'll consider that when you Google it, you're going to find that. But if you use Google Science, you will find hundreds of peer-reviewed published articles that support the kratom safety and addiction liability profile that will support this legislation. And with respect to law enforcement and the medical societies, I quoted the AMA. The American Medical Association was under intense pressure to do what the Wisconsin Medical Association and, for example, the Mississippi Medical Association wanted them to do, and they rejected it because they looked at it closely. These are doctors who analyzed it, and you can look at their resolution. It does not support the criminalization or scheduling of kratom, and in fact set standards which we completely agree with on that score. Lastly, I would ask you to consider two things. NIDA has done intoxication studies of metrogeny, kratom. That's the principal alkaloid, metrogeny, and they see no impairment on driving. So when you hear the informed discussion about what its impacts are. Kratom at normal dosages and responsible use alerts people. It will alert your truck drivers. I mean, it's a better substance than what they might be taking that would create impairments, and there's studies that show that. And then I would ask you to listen to the people of Wisconsin who will testify here today that will tell you that Kratom has changed their lives, that it's improved the quality of their life. And I've been at dozens and dozens of hearings around the country where people have said it saved my life. And I think you need to listen to those people. I'll defer to Dr. Indy.
Just very little to add to that. As a Minnesotan, a Mayo Clinic is revered. Hold the Mayo in this case, they got it wrong. And I met with the controlled substance staff people in Minnesota, and they fortunately rejected Mayo Clinic's advice. They said, look, we've got serious problems. Kratom is not one of them, and we don't want to create a problem. And what do I mean by create a problem? Banning it and then having people having to go even further to get their kratom, or going back to serious opioids. Most medical organizations follow the FDA advice, and Mr. Shinholm, who's here today, will, with drug treatment clinics, it's the same with many drug treatment clinics who will only prescribe buprenorphine and other drugs that are FDA approved. I helped develop buprenorphine. I'm proud of that. It saves lives, but it's not for everybody.
Representative Hong.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. Can you reiterate, can you repeat for us how many states have banned the use of kratom? I know that we're one of 4 or 5.
6.
6.
6, and 1, Vermont has already rescinded it. They're in the process of doing their rulemaking to remove it from their controlled substances list.
And how many states currently regulate the use of kratom?
11.
11. Were you involved in the process for, the policymaking process there as well?
On behalf of consumers, which we represent, we have advocated for the framework of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in all of those states, and it's currently active in 6 more states this year, including Wisconsin, and we expect that there'll be hearings in probably 30 states next year. And our whole goal is to get the FDA to do what they should be doing, which is properly regulating it from a federal level.
In those other states, have you had conversations with law enforcement?
Yes.
Okay, I want to just, we have the folks here who have registered against or for, and the folks who have registered against include the Badger State Sheriff's Association, the Wisconsin Academy of Family Physicians, Wisconsin Chiefs of Police Association, the Wisconsin Medical Society, and the Wisconsin Sheriffs and Deputy Sheriffs Association. My final question is, in your work, and you've been doing this for quite some time now, our law enforcement officers, we here in this building, this very beautiful building, in policymaking, often are somewhat removed from just the realities of what it's like on the ground. And I think my concern right now is we have folks who are representing experiences where, they're seeing, it does give me pause that every single one of these associations has registered against. So I'm wondering, can you describe a little bit more what your experience has been, or have there been partnerships with law enforcement, at a local level that you maybe have encouraged folks to do, or where, some of that, or if you can basically, can you outline for us what the potential partnership with law enforcement has looked like in your lobbying efforts?
I can, thank you. With respect to medical societies, there are a couple of states where the medical societies have raised their strong objections, which in fact led to the review by the American Medical Association on a resolution proposed then, and I suspect supported by the Wisconsin Medical Society, where that was changed by the American Medical Association House of Delegates to what I described. It does not support what the Wisconsin Medical Association's objection to this legislation is. And in fact, we embrace it and we support it. With respect to law enforcement, I have to tell you, this is unique in Wisconsin, because when this issue has been raised with law enforcement agencies across the country, there are 2 responses we get. One is, we don't know what it is, and we hear that consistently. And when they are asked to look at the number of incidents that are kratom related, and we did this a national survey which included Wisconsin, and I think this is an important question to ask, how many actual incidents on crime reports or OWIs or DUIs are you seeing with kratom involved? And consistently across the country, law enforcement agencies have reported that unless it's associated with another substance, you don't see kratom exclusive crimes or DWIs or anything like that. So we find it surprising that the Wisconsin group is so adamantly opposed. I suspect that they're acting on, in good faith, on information they're receiving from the FDA. We did have a Nevada law enforcement officer who reported that he had been on a webinar call with the FDA where they had recommended that all law enforcement agencies oppose this. You'll hear from Senator Bramble from the state of Utah talk about this, where in Utah, the first state to pass the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and what law enforcement's experience had been. I think they're vastly different. We should not base our opposition to kratom on opinions or biases. We should look at data, and you have to find out in Wisconsin, and we, in the hearing with the Controlled Substances Board, heard clearly that there's not a significant problem with kratom only in any law enforcement issue in the state of Wisconsin. I can't account for why, that they're opposing it on that basis, but that's at least the factual basis that was presented to your Controlled Substances Board, and we see consistently across the country.
Representative Balde.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your testimony. I see that one of you is from DC, the other is around the DC area. So I'm sure a lot of politics from DC may be coming here. But anyway, my question is, first of all, I want to just be clear. Are you a representative or an advocate for kratom or no? You're just a consumer advocacy agency, or what relationship do you have with kratom?
So my hat is that I represent the American Kratom Association, a consumer-based organization advocating for the 15 million and growing number of Americans using kratom. I also am here as a kratom consumer. I use kratom, have been for the last 6 years regularly. I'm an old guy, and it helps me with arthritis and pain and that associated with. And I also injured my knee a couple of months ago, so I've increased the amount of kratom. I'm not going to confess that the last time I took some kratom, because I'm here in Wisconsin, but I'm testifying to you under the influence of kratom. Now, if anybody thinks that I'm delusional, maybe I am. If anybody thinks that I'm impaired in some way, maybe you have to see me when I'm not. I don't know, but I don't think that people that make claims about kratom impairing you and somehow, and as Dr. Henningfield said, that when you look at the research, it actually is more alerting. It helps you increase focus, and it takes responsible use. Can you abuse kratom? Absolutely. You can abuse any substance that you choose. Responsible use, and the key to that is good labeling, good instructions on how people should properly use it, and we advocate for that. We think it's an important part of the experience of using kratom.
So you also, then that means basically you are being somehow paid by kratom to do the work that you do. That is true, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm employed by the American Kratom Association.
Excellent. So you also presented yourself as a consumer advocate. You know, what other products do you advocate for outside of kratom?
Other substances?
Yes.
Well, I've been in this space for about 40 years. I had a brief time. I served in the legislature in Utah, so I'm a recovering politician. I served as the chief of staff, Department of Health and Human Services. I worked for Senator Orrin Hatch when he served, and in my career in the advocacy space, I've worked with dietary supplement groups for at least 35 years, advocating for the right of Americans to have the freedom to make choices about responsible use of dietary supplements, which the FDA doesn't like any more than they like kratom, but they have to live with it because the federal government implemented the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act in 1994, which, if the FDA had their power, they would repeal that bill today. They hate dietary supplements, but 80% of the Americans use them and report they're having great effects by them, and it's a $100 billion industry. So consumer acceptance of products the FDA doesn't necessarily like isn't the criteria. It's about how it's helping people, and that's why I referred the representative to listen to the kratom consumers here today, their experiences, why it's helping them, and I think you'll see why I'm so passionate about advocating for them.
May I add something? I helped develop buprenorphine, and I've consulted on that, and I'm proud of it. It saves lives. but it's not for everybody. And one of my colleagues in Johns Hopkins, when she heard what we were doing in the kratom space, she sent me a very personal note thanking me for the effort. I said, Meg, FDA is wrong on the science and the policy, but this is about millions of people for whom kratom is a lifeline. Got a note back, Jack, my son is one of those people. I shiver when I say it because he went to school with my son. He almost overdosed with opioids, got into buprenorphine treatment. It stabilized him, but he hated buprenorphine. He couldn't function. He tried kratom. And she said, we were nervous about it. She's board-certified addiction specialist, professor at Johns Hopkins. And she said, over the next 6 months, he got his life back. And that's what the most common refrain that I hear. And in terms of consumer access, that's vital. I worked on a new form of naloxone or Narcan, and the company jacked up the price, and it wasn't going to help people. So my group formed Harm Reduction Therapeutics to make it truly over-the-counter, non-profit, and it was approved by FDA last July, and it'll start shipping mainly to states to help states save money by getting Narcan much lower and being able to put it in gas stations where people need it. So I'm not a kratom advocate per se. I'm a scientist. I follow the science, and I serve public health. That's why I'm here.
Just to follow up on the last part, being a scientist, what is your opinion on marijuana?
On marijuana?
And what work have you done around it? Yes.
On marijuana. Boy, that is dicey. My lab did some of the lead studies on cannabis. We did the first studies on brownies. We made the brownies in our kitchen and found that same problem that some people sometimes report with, oh shoot, I chewed too much and now I'm screwed. I have concerns about unfettered access and legalization. On the other hand, the balance in the other direction is not good. I'm very glad that right now FDA, DEA, and NIH, I think, are working together to come up with better policies. With kratom, I don't think it should just be
No, so
unregulated.
outside of policies, your scientific, I'm asking for your scientific knowledge and
I'm going to ask the
research.
members to make sure we stick to the bill.
Yeah.
We have to stick to this. Bill's not about marijuana.
Yeah.
It's about
In
kratom.
terms of risks, marijuana carries serious risks in terms of impairing judgment, driving, and other things. We
All
do
right,
not
so
see
let's
that
move
with
on to
kratom.
some other things that has to do with the bill. So, Matt, you reference hundreds of peer reviews out there. Can you give a few examples of agencies, credible agencies that did these peer reviews?
So the National Institute on Drug Abuse has funded about $30 million of our taxpayer money with contractors to do these studies, and dozens and dozens of those are derivative of the funding by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the peer-reviewed studies. And then there are many of the research organizations that are doing it on their own initiative because of the public policy interest. And so you'll see funding that's done independently, has nothing to do with the industry and nothing to do with consumers, but you'll find these studies are being done by government funding or independent research institutions.
So also, can you give an example of proven clinical trials that says that this treat disorders?
Dr. Henningfield wants to take that question, if that's all
Sure.
right.
At this point, the clinical trials in humans are ongoing by National Institute on Drug Abuse funding. Some of them reported at a meeting Monday at the American College of Clinical Pharmacology by the lead night scientist on a panel that I served on. And she talked about the data using driving simulators, safety data. This is a case where also Johnson Foods has done just completed a major 200-person clinical trial to FDA standards, but in Canada, looking at liver, heart, all kinds of safety parameters, 4 different products, 3 different doses, 15-day exposures, and they believe that, and I believe, looking at the data, this should support acceptance of FDA, of their product as a legal FDA-accepted dietary ingredient. More clinical trials are ongoing. One was with pain looking at it for analgesic effects, looking at withdrawal. So these are starting to pop up, mostly with NIDA funding, my old institute. NIDA's website, if you want to look at the science, is very careful, conservative, cautious, but they're I think, the best keepers of the science in the area.
And Mr. Chairman, with your permission, we can provide a list of the peer-reviewed published articles that are available on this subject, and I think you'll see it's hundreds of articles.
Very good. One final question. You referenced also the Wisconsin State Controlled Substance Board. What was your conversation with them like, and where do they stand on this?
So following the hearing last year, there was a request made by the legislature for the Controlled Substances Board to answer the question as to whether or not kratom meets the 8 factors that are a part of the Wisconsin law. And over a period of, I would guess, 9 months, we had many discussions, hearings with the individual constituent groups that comprise the Controlled Substances Board, and the conclusion of that analysis was that it does not meet the criteria. That was, by the way, supported by Concordia University, and I think Dr. Cunningham may be here, I don't know, but he conducted a study and he concluded here in Wisconsin that it doesn't meet the criteria for 8 factors. That's what they concluded. They expressed concerns about just descheduling it and not doing anything else, and we have the same concern. That's why we want this bill.
All right, well, thank you, Chairman.
Representative Snicki.
I'll pass. Representative Balday kind of asked my question.
Okay. Any other questions for our guests here? Representative Gustafson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So looking at the 8-factor, you said that kratom doesn't fit within this standard, and well, your argument is it doesn't fit in the standard.
Well, with respect, not my argument, that was evaluated by the Drug Enforcement Administration, by the Department of Health and Human Services, and by the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence. It does not, by their standard, not mine.
Gotcha. So from any of the studies that either of you would be able to produce, has there been anything that points to kratom being habit forming in any way, shape, or form?
Any what?
Any habit forming, is it develop a dependence?
Oh, for some people, you can develop, like, as with, I think the best analogy is coffee. So with coffee, most daily coffee users have some level of tolerance, and we call it dependence, not addiction, because it's not impairing activities. You get the same thing with kratom with people that are daily users. Most of the kratom consuming population is intermittent. They use it when they have some pain. The people that are daily users mostly are people that are using because of pain or addiction. And my NIDA colleague, she introduced a new technical term yesterday. She said in this population, the use is boring from an addiction perspective. She said, so the people that they've surveyed, and then they've done blood sampling tests to track things, basically the people that have turned to kratom in place of opioids for pain or addiction, she said they get up in the morning, they have their kratom tea or kratom capsules. Some take it in the middle, some later in the evening. She said basically it's not interfering. They get their lives back, unlike for some people buprenorphine. And she said from an addiction perspective, it's boring. She said it's not interfering and impairing life, it's enhancing.
So I think to answer your question, yes, you can develop a dependence. It's a complex area. I think Mr. Shinsholzer can address this as an addiction recovery specialist. You can develop a psychological addiction, which is hard and needs help. In terms of the physical dependence on it, Dr. Henningfield has described that. It's moderate, it's not a difficult problem, and you do not have the same problem weaning off of a kratom addiction from a physical dependence standpoint. It's like my addiction of choice is Diet Coke. I might, if I quit cold turkey, I might have a week of upset stomach, runny nose, and headache. That's the profile for kratom as well.
I would like to leave a copy of the letter that me and my former federal colleagues in scheduling did for the Controlled Substances Board, because it also lists 8 or 10 other substances that all can produce dependence, tolerance, but are not scheduled.
And then just want to follow up to, I just want to make sure I heard this correctly. You said 87% of opioid users that have switched to kratom.
This was in my survey by my colleagues in my department at Hopkins. I did not have input. I independently did a separate study that came up with similar findings. 2 other surveys came up with similar findings. But, so they were looking at people that were reporting use for opioid, and they were finding it for opioids, and they were finding it very helpful in reducing withdrawal. And that wasn't surprising. We convened the leading experts from around the world. We had an expert from every lab that had done a human or animal study in a virtual think tank, and it was published a couple of months ago with the expert opinions of that group. It became the hottest download from the scientific journal.
What kind of
Clarify
time?
if I
what-
could. I'm
And
sorry.
I just want to jump on real quick too with the 87, the same kind of findings that you found. What kind of timeline was that study kind of or survey conducted
what-
over? For the opioid dependency being weaned off if they
So
were to?
what we find is that in people, generally, they make the substitution on their own over a period of usually days, weeks, or even months. My colleague at Hopkins, her son, it was a process. It was a gradual process. He couldn't function on buprenorphine. He tried drug-free clinic, and then he was miserable. He started using kratom, and then he got kicked out of the clinic. So he was on his own, but over a period of months. Usually getting off of addiction is not an event, it is a process. For most people, months, weeks, years, lifetime.
Yeah,
And I'll send you this Johns Hopkins study. What I intended to say, and I hope I didn't misstate it, is that 87% reported a relief from withdrawal symptoms, and so that was what it did. And then subsequently, 35% replaced the opioid they withdrew from with kratom. Not that they're connected in that sense.
Gotcha, thank you. No, just from everything that I've heard, and thank you for testifying very much, is that the right to try kratom has a great impact on the opioid crisis our state is facing. And so that's where, if there is an opportunity, and I know other members on this committee have mentioned other substances that they would like to highlight, but I'm in the category of, if this is going to help alleviate that issue in our state right now, I'm all for this.
May I comment on that?
Absolutely.
One of the first questions that me and my colleagues looked at 10 years ago, and have been monitoring ever since with every federal survey, from NIDA, from SAMHSA, from DEA, the forensic system, the old Dawn, the new Dawn system, you name it, treatment episode data sets. We monitor all of them. Big question was, is kratom a path to opioids or away from opioids? There is no compelling evidence that kratom is a path to opioids. Not that it's never happened, but there's lots of compelling published evidence that it is a path away from opioids. And it reaches people for whom buprenorphine, methadone were not acceptable, not accessible, or they just didn't like it or couldn't function. And for those people, kratom was an alternative that they could do it their own way, on their own, and then they're asking, why would the government take this away from me?
Thank you.
Representative Brooks.
Up on that line of questioning and having gone through the last hearing on this, there seemed to be very little evidence that there's a chemical dependency to kratom. We can use the word addiction or reliance or psychological, but is there a chemical dependency? And I don't want to be flippant about it, but people have addictions to everything. I was watching TV the other day, and
Yes.
there's the lady's eating toilet paper. We don't ban toilet paper. The other lady was eating the cushions out of her seat or out of her car. You know, I mean, it's just absurd what people become addicted to, but there's no scientific evidence that I've read that there's a chemical dependency. I would lean towards, it seems to help people that are dependent on drugs get off them. Like you said, there's not a two-way path. It seems to be more of a one-way path.
I'll be really precise in the terminology, consistent with the lecture Monday at the national meeting in Seattle that I was at from NIDA is not an official NIDA statement, but it's by the lead NIDA scientist. And I'm in agreement with what she testified on everything. First, kratom, chemically, like caffeine, can produce a low-level dependence in the body and some tolerance. And almost everybody that drinks coffee every day or tea or diets, Coke or whatever, has some level of dependence. The question is, does it evolve into what we now call substance use disorder, which is the technical term for addiction, and it used to be dependence. So the DSM-5 calls it substance use disorder. That generally involves impaired life functioning. And so the data, latest data from NIDA is confirming other data that there are very few people for whom kratom is life functioning impairing, rather it restores life functioning. In some cases by intermittent use, in some cases by transient use for a few months to get off of opioids and then they get off of kratom. In other cases by people just making longer term substitution. And we don't call that a substance use disorder or addiction. We just say that's like a chronic pain patient that's using their opioids properly, that is maintained, but they're functioning.
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, sir? Can you overdose on kratom without becoming, I guess there's different forms now, but from what I remember from the prior testimony, you would become violently ill if you were to consume that much.
As we sit here, we do you can never rule out, you can never say never.
Right.
But out of the 107,000 overdose deaths that were documented last year in the United States and about 1,400 in Wisconsin, none that I am aware were confirmed to be exclusively due to kratom. There were some where people were using kratom along with other substances in which the other substances were determined to be the primary cause. We don't even know by how kratom would cause overdose. Every drug that causes overdose has a signature. Opioids, it's respiratory depression. Sedatives, respiratory depression. Alcohol, a lot of times it's aspiration of fluids and everything. Stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine, generally cardiovascular. There is no signature for kratom. Several studies have looked at extremely high doses of key kratom alkaloids in animals. Sounds gross, but it's how you test drugs for safety. It turns out that it's extremely difficult to kill animals. And last year, we did a study following the FDA model to the letter. Literally called FDA staff the night before dosing was to start by the independent contracting laboratory. And we promised FDA we would share the results with them before we shared it to the philanthropy that sponsored the study. And we pushed the dose. The goal was the highest possible dose that was physically administratable or which killed the animals, compared to oxycodone following the FDA protocol. Animals died in the oxycodone case. They had respiratory depression. The curve for kratom was a flat line, meaning no dose, no time did we alter respiratory depression or cause life-threatening effects. That doesn't mean that you can't overdose, but the signal is very low.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging.
Representative Znicki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I was co-sponsor of this bill last session. I did not sign on this session because, as the speaker said yesterday, sometimes we may make mistakes and we have to own up to them. I don't know if it was a mistake or not, but I've just heard since last session so much about this that is very concerning to me. Now, Representative Brooks asked about overdoses on kratom. And there have, from what I could tell, some of the reading I've done, there has been documented overdoses on kratom. In fact, there was just a lawsuit filed earlier this year, I think it was in Florida, against the state, or no, Washington State maybe.
Well, Florida and Washington State, I'd be glad to tell you the circumstances.
Yeah, I'd like to know what the circumstances
Sure.
were, but let me just finish.
Okay.
My other concern is, and I see we do have law enforcement back there, I don't know if you're testifying or not, but there's no actual test to tell if somebody has kratom in their system. I'm going to ask you guys that, so
There is a test.
There is now?
Yes, absolutely. There is a test.
Okay, so you want to tell me about the lawsuit
Sure, there are two that are primary getting a lot of attention. One is, in the state of Washington, there was a jury award for a failure to notify under product liability statutes in the state of Washington, did not examine whether kratom was the substance that caused the death of the individual, and in fact, that never came up as a part of the deal. Only that the kratom vendor was using illegal therapeutic claims to sell the product to that individual. Again, this bill clears that up. We oppose that kind of thing, justified award. In the state of Florida, the second one is more troubling, and that is that the product that was ingested by the decedent was called space dust. It was manufactured by a company that made claims in their marketing material that this was super potent and enhanced kratom, which means it wasn't pure kratom. It didn't pass any standard for safety, and the product was sold in a plastic pouch with no labeling, nothing on the back of it. On the front, the vendor had taken a magic marker or a Sharpie and put space dust on it. Now, that product should never have been on the market. The FDA should have blocked it, and they didn't, and they won't. And that's why this state legislation is so important. In the state of Washington, that product should not have been on the market. When they make an illegal therapeutic claim, they should be removed from the marketplace. That's what this bill will do. Any of the deaths that are allegedly associated with kratom, if you look at the Centers for Disease Control report, where they looked at 91 deaths that were claimed by medical examiners to be caused by kratom, were actually just detected kratom in the system. 67% had fentanyl. And then it goes down to cocaine and methadone, all kinds of things are in their system. Only 7 were reported to be kratom only, and so the CDC said, let's see the blood samples. 4 of those 7 had blood samples available. They tested those. They found it was polydrug use using more sophisticated equipment that medical examiners wouldn't have. This issue is confused by medical examiners who are listening to the FDA and not doing the proper analytical work to give the truth to the families that have decedents here. Kratom is not the problem, it's polydrug use.
Can I just add, in that article is widely cited in the media in some studies as showing that 91 deaths were kratom overdoses. They didn't bother to read what CDC actually said. What CDC actually said is what Mr. Haddow just told you. But it's misreported in the media.
And as far as the test, kratom can be tested easily, and it's done by your lab here. Last year, we heard testimony from the law enforcement officers that you can't test for it. That's not true. And your lab tests for kratom because it is a controlled substance. So we think facts should direct this public policy and science, not opinions and whims and misstatements.
One more quick question, if I could, because I'd really like to move on and to hear from actual people that aren't being paid to be here. Where is kratom grown? I mean, how is it grown? Where is it grown? Greenhouses, Southeast Asia? Do we have farms that grow it?
The majority of kratom is sourced today from Southeast Asia. Now Africa's gotten into the marketplace significantly. It is grown in Hawaii, and there are plans to scale up production in Hawaii to commercial grade quantities that will support the American population. It's grown in Florida. Any place you have a tropical environment with water that sustains the growth of the kratom plant, they're finding success with it. There are greenhouses that grow it too. That's a little complex because the trees can grow quite tall, but there is a greenhouse in West Virginia that grows kratom as well.
Okay, any other questions from the committee? Representative Brooks.
One more. It was brought up, the Mayo study, I think you put that to rest. I was just reading an article from Harvard, because we keep referring to the FDA as this enlightened entity, yet over the last 10 years, 14,000 drugs that they approved were recalled. So to hold the FDA up as a standard, can you talk to, and I know you mentioned it earlier, but I had dug out for another hearing, the reluctance for the FDA to remove any, claims to this thing, or they're doing the same thing with marijuana, not declassifying even though it's legal in how many states. What is the holdup with the FDA? And can you talk to the percentage of drugs that they have approved and recalled? Like I said, I know the Harvard study said 14,000 in the last 10 years. That's a lot of drugs.
I work with the FDA every day. I've been involved in dozens and dozens of drug approvals, and I'm really proud of that. Most of them serve people. Mistakes are made sometimes in approval. It's always a balancing act. Are as FDA moving too quickly or too slowly? In the area of dietary supplements, FDA opposed DSHEA in 1994. FDA thought everything that was dietary should be an approved drug or not on the market. DSHEA created a pathway for people like my wife who prefer dietary ingredients and natural products and use drugs when she has to. FDA is not comfortable with that. FDA has said, well, the kratom should be developed as a drug. Well, guess what? That's roughly a 10-year, billion-dollar process, and you end up with a refined product that isn't like the original and isn't something my wife would use. Or they say, go the botanical drug route. There have been 800 applications for that. 2 have been approved in 15 years. I've worked on several, and they all failed and bailed out. I don't understand the hang-up. I know that not everybody at FDA is in agreement with that policy.
If I could just add on the FDA, in 2018, when the recommendation by the FDA to the Drug Enforcement Administration to schedule kratom was withdrawn by the Assistant Secretary for Health, the question was whether that would be made public, because we as an advocacy organization didn't know about it. We didn't know about it for 2.5 years. And the reason is the FDA told the Assistant Secretary for Health's office they were invoking the FOIA restriction on ongoing regulatory review. And it took Congressman Mark Pocan with a Republican colleague from Virginia to do a FOIA request, a direct request to HHS to get that letter. A month after that revocation withdrawal actually occurred, then FDA Commissioner Gottlieb was on the public airwaves claiming kratom was an opioid. And he knew that that letter, that rescission letter, had decried that, it had refuted that. And yet he did it anyway. So the FDA, unfortunately, has not been honest with the American public with respect to kratom. And we think it's time for the sunlight to come in, good regulations, and let's protect American consumers.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time to travel to our great state.
Thank you very much.
Can I leave this with somebody?
Yes. There, right at the sergeant's desk. And gentlemen, anything you want to get to the committee, go ahead and email it to my office, and the clerk will distribute it. Next up, we're going to take Christopher Cunningham, and then I'm going to go to the Wisconsin Medical